Okay, picture this. It's April 28, 2025. Suddenly, lights go out. Not just your block, but across Spain, Portugal, parts of southern France.
And potentially much, much wider. The source we're looking at suggests maybe two-thirds of the entire planet.
Two-thirds, just
Yeah.
silence, darkness. The grid is down, maybe everywhere. What happens in that moment, when something like electricity just vanishes
That's a
globally?
huge disruption, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, your mind immediately goes to how. What could cause something so widespread, so simultaneous?
Absolutely. And that how is really the core of what we're digging into today in this deep dive. We've got some, well, pretty fascinating material shared with us. Our main source is a transcript from a hypnotic regression session. It apparently aimed to investigate the specific April 28th blackout.
And crucially, we also have a second source that gives essential context. It's another transcript, but this one explains the specific method they used, the Grifasi Method. You really need to understand the method to properly weigh the information.
Right. Without that, it's much harder to make sense of what came out of the session. So our mission today is pretty clear. Unpack everything from these sources. We want to pull out the surprising details, the claims about causes, impact.
And layer it with those critical insights about the method itself. It's about seeing the event through this, well, unique lens, but also understanding the lens.
Exactly. Being informed means looking at the info, sure, but also knowing where it came from, what the filters might be. Okay, so let's unpack this event itself as the first source describes it. April 28th, 2025. This massive blackout.
Yeah, the source starts by pinpointing those initial areas you mentioned.
Sure.
Spain, Portugal, parts of southern France. It kind of anchors it geographically first.
Before expanding.
Yeah.
Which it definitely does. Later on, the scale just balloons. The perception becomes, like you said, potentially two-thirds of the planet affected. That's hard to even imagine.
Almost unthinkable, yeah.
Yeah.
And the immediate human reaction described in that session transcript, it's very telling. It talks about widespread uncertainty, people scrambling, trying to communicate.
Doubt, confusion.
Yeah, that palpable sense of doubt spreading, it really captures that initial shock, losing something so fundamental.
So, okay, faced with this huge mystery, this massive outage, how did the people in this session try to figure out the cause?
Well, the first source says they use the Grifasi method. And our second source explains this involves an external operator guiding a telepathic subject, ideally someone who doesn't know the topic beforehand.
Right, and the subject explores it telepathically in hypnotic state.
Exactly.
So when the subject in this session entered the cables, trying to follow the energy,
Right.
what did they find?
Well, this is one of the first really surprising bits from the source. The subject reported finding nothing. No energy flow, no physical damage, no fault.
Nothing broken?
Nope. It was perceived as if a switch had just been flipped off, suspending the flow entirely without, destroying the infrastructure.
So where did the energy actually go, according to the session? It couldn't just vanish, could it?
Apparently not. The perception recorded was specific, intraterrestrial.
Intraterrestrial?
Yeah. The energy reportedly imploded inwards, absorbed by the globe itself. Now, that term, intraterrestrial in this context, seems to mean drawn into the Earth, not just dissipated or lost.
Okay, absorbed by the Earth. And was there any, conventional physical reason found for this sudden absorption? A solar flare, a technical failure?
No. According to the source, nope. It explicitly states no physical or material cause was found through this exploration. The effect, the energy being absorbed, was linked to something external.
Something external, described as a kind of wave, ultra-supersonic.
Precisely that. The source connects the energy absorption to an ultra-supersonic wave, or maybe a shot coming from space. So the perceived chain of events is external trigger from space causes Earth to absorb its own electrical grid energy. Non-physical cause, physical effect.
Wow. Okay, what's fascinating here is how fast the source moves past purely physical stuff. And this is where it gets really interesting. It dives into what it calls the esoteric cause, the metaphysical.
Yes, it totally shifts gears. The cause is perceived as being outside our normal physical reality. It's described as some kind of deep dispute, a conflict between different energetic entities or beings.
Like a parliament. That's the analogy used, right?
Yeah, a parliament where different groups have different stances on, well, dominating Earth, essentially.
A demonstration of power, the source says, by these energies wanting control or influence over the planet.
And this conflict, reportedly, involves lots of different beings and races. The source specifically names Reptilians and Draconians as being involved in this perceived struggle.
Oh, wait, reptilians, draconians? These are major claims coming out of this session. And while we're talking about these perceived entities and conflicts, we absolutely have to remember what our second source says about the method.
Crucial point.
That information from single sessions like this one, it's described as highly susceptible to contamination, distortion. The source itself warns you, don't take it as pure gold.
Absolutely. That context from source 2 is key. These details about, esoteric causes, specific entity names, that's what reportedly came up in this one session. But the method's own explanation tells us that kind of info needs serious validation across many, many sessions.
Right. He needs that rigorous cross-checking to be seen as reliable within their own framework.
Okay, so keeping that major caveat in mind, let's go back to the first source. Amidst this perceived conflict, it also mentions neutral arbitrators.
Correct. 3 beings perceived as neutral were apparently present. The description in the source is quite visual, cone-like shapes wearing black and gold tunics, compared to angel figures even.
And their role was?
Arbitrators. They were seen as an equilibrating energy. Their job, according to the session, was to step in and tell the warring factions that their time was up, their contract was over.
Telling them to respect a higher order.
Basically, yeah. Respect order. It's presented as this kind of cosmic balancing act happening behind the scenes of the Blackout. It really does take the whole event into a completely different perceived reality. Okay, let's shift to the human level described in the source. Governments, people, collective consciousness. Were governments totally blindsided?
Well, according to the source, not completely. It claims governments knew about the possibility of something like this. A large-scale event.
The latent threat.
Exactly. It had been seen as a latent threat for a long time, apparently, though the source says they didn't know when it would happen or how, just that it could.
And there's a really significant claim in there about government autonomy, or lack of it.
Yeah, that's a striking part of the source material. It flat out states that governments know about these non-physical beings, and it claims no ruler on Earth is truly autonomous.
Wow.
The assertion is that there are agreements, deals in place, and decisions are influenced, maybe even made upstairs by these energetic spheres or entities. We have to be clear, this is purely what the source alleges about this perceived relationship. We're just reporting its content.
Right. Reporting the claim. And again, these are huge claims. Source 2's caution about single-session distortion feels especially relevant when you hear stuff like that. So what about the general population, the collective consciousness? How did people react as seen in the source?
It was mixed, apparently. You had the immediate fear, the need for security, trying to communicate that stuff we mentioned. But the source also highlights a different group, a more resilient one.
Tied to lessons learned from things like the 2020 experience.
Yes, that's the connection the source makes. This group is described as being adaptable, immediately looking for alternatives.
Like meeting up in person.
Yeah, gathering physically, talking, forming groups, finding other things to do if they couldn't work, adapting.
And this adaptation, this finding new ways, the source links that to human progress, evolution.
It does, yeah. The source seems to view this group's ability to pivot, to find possibilities and overcome the difficulty, as actually being a key driver for human evolution.
Interesting. And what about the government's actions after the blackout? Still according to the source.
Well, the source indicates they're looking for the cause, obviously, but also, perhaps more pointedly, developing new alternative mechanisms.
Mechanisms for?
For control. Control over the population in response to what happened. If you connect the dots, it does raise that interesting question about what happens after a crisis. You seek understanding, sure, but maybe also control.
Dual impulses. Okay, so we've covered the event, the perceived causes, physical, external, esoteric, the entities, the human responses, all from source 1. But like we keep saying, source 2 is critical for framing all this.
Absolutely. It gives us the methodology. It's not just what source 1 says, but how they reportedly got that information. That matters hugely.
And source 2 basically comes with its own warning label, doesn't it?
A big one, yes.
Yeah.
A very important one. It explicitly states that information from single hypnotic sessions, like the one in source 1, is considered highly contaminated and distorted. Within their own framework, it's not finished, reliable data, not by itself.
Why so contaminated according to source 2? What are the reasons?
Well, it's multi-layered. Information reportedly travels through many dimensions, many densities. It passes through different minds, different consciousnesses, what the source calls ether, or the field.
Concepts related to non-physical realms.
Kinda, yeah. Informational spaces. And during that transmission, it can get intercepted, twisted,
Yeah.
maybe deliberately by entities, maybe just by their presence. And crucially, it gets heavily filtered, colored by the subject's own stuff, beliefs, mentality, opinions, perspective.
So you're not getting a clean signal. You're getting something that's passed through a lot of filters, potentially distorting ones.
That's the idea. The source also brings up connection issues. If the subject isn't really connected to the target, it uses an example of trying to investigate a historical figure. They have no link to the target, might not even allow access to info.
And then what happens?
Opportunistic entities might jump in, fill the gap, impersonate the target, or just make stuff up for their own reasons.
Source 2 also draws a clear line between client sessions and research sessions, right?
Yes. Client sessions focus on the individual client, their issues, authorized by them. Research sessions, aiming for broader truths. They need a much stricter protocol if the results are meant to be reliable.
And what is that protocol for what they consider true research?
It's described as long, hard work, really extensive. Not one session, but hundreds, maybe even thousands of sessions.
Thousands.
Yeah, and conducted with different people, all following one unique, rigorous protocol.
Asking the exact same questions over and over.
Exactly. Identical questions across a huge number of different subjects. The really reliable information, what Source 2 calls the gold nuggets, that's defined as only the tiny percentage of findings that show up consistently, commonly, across almost all those sessions.
Wow, like panning for gold.
Pretty much. Sifting tons of sand for a few tiny grains.
So applying this, what does it really mean for the information we got from Source 1, the blackout details, the causes, entities, governments, all that stuff?
It means that's what emerged in that one specific session. That's the output of one exploration.
And according to the method itself, explained in Source 2, we should approach that single session info with, well, significant caution.
Exactly. It's fascinating data point, sure. Maybe a starting point for more digging. But it's nowhere near the validated gold nuggets that would only come, supposedly, after that massive cross-validated research cycle. It's info that comes with its own built-in question mark about reliability because of that stated potential for contamination and distortion.
Right. It's not just about reporting the findings, it's reporting the findings with the system's own caution about how they were gathered. It's actually a really powerful way to see the complexity of evaluating unconventional information sources. Okay, let's wrap up by looking at the end of Source 1 again. The perceptions of the future from the subject's viewpoint, looking ahead from, say, early May 2025.
Okay. The perception for the near to medium future is described as having more serenity, an expectation that mechanisms get developed to control or prevent similar events.
Control mechanisms again.
Yeah. Which in turn apparently fosters the development of new alternative technologies, leading to less dependence on the current electrical grids.
Autonomous energy is mentioned specifically.
Yes, the source talks about new ways to generate autonomous electricity, moving away from the usual mechanisms. It even specifically brings up Nikola Tesla's name.
Tesla.
Yeah, and an image of rays capturing energy, perceived as drawing it from that ether or field we mentioned earlier.
And looking even further out, what's the perception?
Further out, the perception is of a future where we don't rely on current generators at all, but instead take energy directly from space, again, described like rays.
Will future blackouts happen on the same scale according to this?
The source suggests no. While new tech might be adopted gradually, not for everyone all at once, that massive two-thirds of the planet scale of the April 28th event isn't seen repeating in the same way.
And the overall feeling projected for the future state?
Is one of stability returning, equilibrium, daily life flowing naturally again. Yeah, that part of the source is interesting. It suggests that even within this narrative filled with disruption and, well, very unconventional forces, there's still a perceived path towards adaptation.
Yeah.
And potentially huge changes in how we deal with energy.
So this deep dive has really taken us down quite the rabbit hole, exploring these claims from a hypnotic session about a massive global blackout in 2025. We've looked at the reported effects, the triggers, external and internal, and these deeply unconventional esoteric causes and entities the source describes.
We touched on the reported reactions of governments and people, glimpsed those potential future adaptations, and, maybe most importantly, we integrated that critical context from Source 2, the explanation of the method itself, which gives us a vital framework for thinking about the reliability, the potential limits of the information from Source 1.
It's like a built-in guide on how to approach these fascinating but definitely complex claims. Understanding source material like this and understanding the methods used to get that information That seems absolutely key, doesn't it? For navigating complex topics and forming your own informed perspectives in a world just flooded with information.
Exactly. Hopefully this deep dive gives you some tools for thinking critically about this kind of unconventional material when you encounter it.
Yeah, and consider the tension here. You have this report of a world event with potentially non-physical causes, maybe involving non-autonomous governments.
Juxtaposed with this crucial insight from the method's own explanation. That information about such extraordinary claims, especially from single unconventional explorations, is inherently complex. It requires rigorous validation across multiple perspectives to be considered reliable within that system.
So how does that potential for contaminated or filtered information, especially when dealing with descriptions of non-physical realities, entities, how does that shape our own understanding of what's real, what's possible? Definitely something to mull over.
Indeed. Food for thought.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.